Welcome to A Life, a Decade, a Century. This is Aladac History. My name is Aiden, your host, and I'll be bringing you on a journey through 2,000 years of history, decade by decade, life by life. In our first ambitious voyage, we'll begin with the 1st century CE, where we'll meet emperors and rebels, philosophers and generals, mystics and politicians. In this century, 2 major world empires are coming into their own, but also experiencing difficulties both inside and out. We'll see what the empires looked like from those loyal to it and those seeking to fight it back or destroy it from the inside. We'll see how the expansion and colonialism of these empires led to war, religious revolution, philosophical and cultural synthesis, and the trade spanning all of Eurasia. This is episode 1 of A Life, a Decade, a Century. What exactly is A Life, a Decade, a Century? This aims to be a 20-part series from the 1st century to the 20th. Each episode has 10 figures, 1 per decade, who are important to the historical record, whose stories can allow us to trace threads of history and tell a narrative through the decades. I have a couple of starting notes. First, I'm not a historian, so please correct me. I intend that I'll have to do corrections videos after the episodes come out, so expert commenters can certainly help out that process by pointing out any inaccuracies. Second, I'm going to use CE, not AD, because I like it better. You don't need to. Finally, I'm going to follow this first episode up with a short video of rules and notes. This will go over some ground rules that I'm following, as well as the process of my research, my writing, and so on. Now, without further ado, let's begin by diving into the 1st century and the first episode of A Life, a Decade, a Century. This is Aladac History. We begin with a look into our first life in the year 5 CE. The elderly Roman couple strolls leisurely through the ornate gardens of a beautiful villa atop the Palatine Hill. The man's name was once Octavian, and his wife, a confidant, advisor, and friend over the years, is Livia. The two stop to share a reminiscent glance over the city of Rome as the winter sun casts long shadows across marble colonnades, still bearing fresh chisel marks. In the distance, the gleaming white of the buildings of the Campus Martius reflects the setting sun. There, his new and massive mausoleum will fulfill its purpose, waiting for the man to take his place and ascend to godhood with his predecessor. The man who was Octavian stands at the pinnacle of his powers. He is more than the leader of Rome. He's commander-in-chief of 25 legions, tribune with the power to veto any magistrate, censor of public morality, though he himself has enforced divorce on a pregnant Livia so that they could marry, Pontifex Maximus, chief priest to the gods, Primus inter pares, the first citizen. He is Augustus now, meaning something along the lines of a majestic, or the increaser. He is emperor in all but name, and quietly he is the final unmaker of the republic that he's inherited. Augustus is 67 years old, and his body is beginning to fail him now. His hands, which once signed the proscription lists condemning 300 senators to death, now tremble slightly with age. But even in the twilight of his life, his mind remains sharp and his will composed, assets that led him to the position of grandeur and total power that he now finds himself in. Born into relative obscurity as Gaius Octavius, son of a provincial politician and military tribune, Augustus has risen from obscure adolescent to master of the Mediterranean. His journey was marked by calculated brutality and political genius. When Caesar's secret, dying will named his teenage grandnephew as principal heir and adoptive son, many of Rome's power brokers were wary and skeptical and perhaps underestimated the 19-year-old who would dare to claim Caesar's legacy. But Octavian understood something about the Rome of his day. Cash bought loyalty, and loyalty commanded armies. Within months, he had liquidated his inheritance, taken staggering loans, and begun recruiting Caesar's veterans with promises of land and gold. At his first public appearance as Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, a comet appeared during the games honoring Venus Genetrix. His propagandists immediately proclaimed it Caesar ascending to divinity. Augustus understood the complexity and importance of politics and religious life. He carefully positioned himself as son of the deified one, Divi Filius, after Caesar's death, simultaneously claiming divine connection while avoiding direct worship during his lifetime. His revival of ancient priesthoods and restoration of 82 temples across Rome earned him the title Pontifex Maximus, combining religious and political authority. This religious program was not merely decorative. It systematically established a precedent where emperors became divine after death, creating the imperial cult that would become a unifying force across diverse provinces. In the East, this adapted to existing ruler worship traditions, while in the West it introduced an entirely new religious framework centered on Rome. By making imperial worship a test of loyalty without demanding locals abandon their own gods, Augustus created a flexible religious system that bound the empire together while accommodating local traditions. But Augustus's path was not always a secure one. Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted cavalry commander and fellow consul, initially treated the boy heir with contempt. Antony had assumed that he was in pole position to inherit Caesar's estate and assets, and was resentful of the fact that a boy without much military acumen to speak of would be favored to him. But Octavian, the boy, proved more dangerous than the veteran general could have imagined. He rallied public opinion through funeral games for Caesar funded by borrowed money, while secretly courting Antony's own troops with promises of bonus payments. The tension was briefly stalled, as an alliance of convenience formed when three men carved up Rome's carcass. Octavian, Antony, and another general Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate, their first act a brutal exercise in political cleansing. The proscription lists they posted murdered for profit and revenge. 300 senators, 2,000 equites, their wealth confiscated, their heads displayed in the forum. Cicero, often touted as Rome's greatest orator, a critic of Antony's and early advocate of Octavian's, was among them. His head and hands were nailed to the rostra, where he had denounced tyranny. Octavian's genius saw the strategic use of violence purge his enemies and clear his path, but it also meant shrewd diplomacy. After initial tension, he strengthened bonds with Mark Antony through marriage. His beloved sister Octavia became Antony's wife, but distance and ambition corroded the peace. Antony, by the accounts of his detractors in Rome, became intoxicated by Eastern luxury and Cleopatra's presence, abandoning not just Octavia, but Roman traditions. He adopted Egyptian dress, reclined at banquet on Cleopatra's couch, and declared their children heirs to Eastern kingdoms. And so the road to war was paved with calculated indignation. Octavian did not merely expose Antony's dying will, he had it seized from the Vestal virgins who guarded it, perhaps even altered its contents. Before an outraged Senate, he read how Antony planned to move Rome's capital to Alexandria, to divide eastern provinces among his bastard children, to transform Rome's eastern protectorates into an Egyptian empire. Whether truth or forgery mattered little. By 32 BCE, the Senate revoked Antony's powers and Italy swore a personal oath to Octavian, not to Rome, but to him alone. The confrontation at Actium proved decisive not through military brilliance, but through defection. Antony's fleet, rotten from inactivity, leaked like sieves. His army muttered about Octavian's payments and changing political tides. When Cleopatra's 60 ships suddenly raised sail and fled, taking Antony with her, his remaining forces melted away. Octavian accepted the surrender of 17 legions without bloodshed. Egypt's grain became Rome's bread, Cleopatra's treasure became Octavian's war chest, and the last Ptolemaic queen died most likely by suicide, ensuring she could take her own life rather than giving her enemies the honors. The aftermath revealed Octavian's calculated mercy and mercilessness. Antony's Roman children by Octavia were raised in honor. Cleopatra's son by Caesar, possibly a threat to Octavian's adoptive claim, vanished into execution. Egypt was an immediate windfall for Octavian, its wealth flowing directly into his treasury. At age 33, Octavian controlled the Mediterranean. The Republic, already gutted by civil war, died its final death. But Octavian was too clever to gain himself the unpopular title of despot king. He fashioned the Principate instead, leading to the propping up of a nominal republic as his autocratic power took root. The Palatine Hill, along which Livia and Augustus now walk, has been home to Augustus for most of his adult life. His house, deliberately modest compared to Caesar's mansion below, speaks volumes. According to the historian Suetonius, one of a slew of historians who we will find it hard to distinguish from propagandists, Augustus apparently sleeps on military-style cots, eats simple food, wears homespun tunics crafted by his wife, a calculated contrast to Eastern potentates. Suetonius also gives us Augustus's supposed political motto, which is instructive: festina lente, to make haste slowly. While amassing absolute power, he has courted senators with respect bordering on deference, biding his time while he solidifies his grip. Livia fingers a coin, one of the first minted with his new title, Caesar Augustus. The image shows him forever young, eternally handsome, a lie that became visual truth repeated across the empire. In reality, Augustus has suffered from chronic illness most of his life. Weak left hip, troublesome stomach, constant colds. His teeth were, quote, small, few, and decayed. But the state-sponsored image persisted: divine youth, eternal vigor, a ruler whose very presence restored the Golden Age. Livia's husband understood power's many faces. He could be merciful, granting full citizenship to freed slaves who proved worthy, and he could be ruthless, eliminating threats with poison, exile, or accident. He built the Vigiles, fire brigade, and established the Cursus Publicus, postal system, creating infrastructure that bound empire together while surveilling it. He passed moral legislation restricting adultery and encouraging marriage and childbearing among the upper classes, laws he himself violated again by enforcing Livia's divorce, as we've said, while pregnant in order to marry her. Most significantly, his census and tax systems standardized revenue collection across the Mediterranean, funding both his building programs and the military machine that secured borders. These innovations were not just effective, they established governance patterns that would be followed for centuries by successors who lacked his personal charisma, but inherited his institutional framework. Even Livia, whom he seemed to cherish to a degree, was not fully immune to his calculated nature. Their marriage, while loving by Roman standards, was first and foremost a political alliance. She brought valuable Claudian bloodline, and he offered protection after her first husband had opposed Octavian. Yet he indeed treated her with unusual respect for a Roman matron, financial independence, public statues, and real influence in imperial decisions. Augustus's greatest achievement may have been in creating a template for imperial rule that his successors would emulate for centuries. His cultivation of modesty while wielding absolute power, his careful balance of military authority with civilian governance, his strategic use of family for succession planning, and his extensive public works programs established patterns that defined, quote, good emperorship. Future emperors would be judged by these standards. Did they maintain the fiction of the Principate while exercising autocratic power? Did they respect senatorial dignity while diminishing senatorial authority? Could they project military strength without appearing tyrannical? But to millions across the empire, this good emperorship was irrelevant. Augustus would come to bring something darker. The Pax Romana, Roman peace, meant submission to Rome's order. As we'll shortly uncover, in the fringes of the empire, far from the Palatine Hill, colonized tribes are destroyed, popular religious movements are stamped out, wealth is stolen, and hundreds of thousands are forced into slavery. And indeed, we will see, through the words of satirists and the actions of politicians and schemers within Rome itself, that violence, disparity, and debauchery will continue to define Roman society for generations. Opposition brews, while Augustus enjoys the city of marble that he has created by his own account. But now we lift off from the first decade of the first century, and as we do, we travel across the continent of Eurasia to an empire that struggles under its own weight and experiences its own internal contradictions. We head thousands of miles eastward to an empire interrupted, wealth disparity, unearned political appointments, people living with no moral compass and yet making critical political decisions. As Augustus's Rome is solidifying as a power, Han China has crumbled and is now stolen by a usurper. It is 17 CE in China, and a different leader studies the texts of a great ancient philosopher, seeking clarity. This leader, like Augustus, is ambitious and affected by enormous will to power. But unlike Augustus, his political calculus seems to be going wrong. Wearing the yellow imperial robes, Wang Mang puts his fingers to his temples in frustration. The former regent turned usurper, now emperor, sits alone in his study in the imposing imperial palace of Chang'an, surrounded by scrolls of classical texts and astrological charts. His eyes trace the characters of the Analects of Confucius, the same philosophy that's guided him for decades and built his reputation as a most moral scholar. Outside his window, the gardens he has meticulously redesigned in strict accordance with classical Zhao era patterns stand silent in the pre-dawn darkness. Outside of his gardens, crises are many. Hyperinflation, famine, starvation, and corruption are leading to rebellion. Wang Mang has brought much of this on himself. The emperor is 62 years old, the first and only emperor of the Jin dynasty he founded just 4 years ago. His ascent was meteoric, sustained by genuine reform and strategic marriages that bound him to the Han imperial family. Wang Mang has risen through scholarship and virtue, or so he's presented to the world. He's a student of ancient texts, he has held the Chinese classics near and dear, and has gained a reputation as the most ethically pure man of his generation. Wang Mang's early expertise was demonstrated as commander of the armed forces, wherein he practiced personal self-discipline and promoted individuals based on merit rather than family or status. His path to power accelerated when he came back from a politically imposed early retirement to secure regency to the 10-year-old child Emperor Ping. Having spent his retirement courting the support of commoners and officials alike, and living ethically by Confucian values, and with the support of a politically savvy aunt, the Grand Empress Dowager Wang, Wang Mang found his way back not only into command of the armed forces, but also into a position that effectively gave him control over the government. This was when Wang Mang truly got to cooking. An albino pheasant makes the same guttural call it makes every morning, briefly breaking Wang's concentration. It cocks its head in the manicured Zhao-inspired garden. Supposedly, the white bird was a sign of divine favor for Wang, presented by distant tribes to the south. Now, it's more a sign to him of his own deceitful ways. For the bird, like many other gifts presented as signs from the heavens, was in reality the product of a bribe that he had paid to local leadership to justify his cult of personality and secure the idea that his rise to power was prophesied. The mandate of heaven manifest. Throughout his regency, Wang had encouraged people from across the realm to submit false prophecies about him, and all the while he instituted his absolutist reforms over the helpless child Emperor Ping, while banishing and forcing suicide upon or outright killing many of his own political rivals or any of Ping's potentially dangerous family members or allies. Wang Mang had correctly assessed that the Han dynasty, soon to be known as the Western Han dynasty, had already weakened itself through political corruption and economic disparity, and he positioned himself as the answer, the scholar official who would restore China to the mythical golden age of the ancient sage kings. He led disaster relief efforts for flood victims, reduced his own salary, and promoted education based on merit rather than birth. And when the time came, according to theory, he spiked the child Emperor Ping's wine, and then, in an absolutely devious move, wrote a note saying how he wished the boy wouldn't die and that he would give anything to trade places with him. Just in case anybody was looking for exonerating evidence. So let's keep a critical eye on this fact, because historians after Wang, who we will meet in the future, had very good reason to distance themselves from him. But the tale is certainly not out of the realm of possibility, and it's certainly interesting anyhow. And so by 9 CE, Wang Mang's scheming had paid off, and he became the emperor of his own new Jin dynasty, Jin literally meaning new, uprooting Han control and immediately making sweeping policy changes. He attempted to abolish private land ownership, nationalize natural resources, and recreate the economic systems described in texts over 1,000 years old. Even the names of administrative units were changed to match classical texts exactly, as if calling a prefecture by its ancient name could resurrect Zhou-era governance. One should give some credit to Wang Mang. His popularity is testament to a popular vision of a future and a successful diagnosis of numerous systemic problems that were baked into the China of his day. After all, his quote that the strong possess lands by the thousands of mu, meaning acre, while the weak have nothing or nowhere to place a needle, clearly struck a chord with many of the peasantry of the late Western Han. This kind of revolutionary thinking presents a vision for radical redistribution that will echo far, far into the future, both in China and elsewhere. But 13 years after seizing regency and 8 years into his reign as emperor, Wang Mang now confronts the consequences of treating philosophy as policy. His land reforms have created chaos among farming communities who had worked private plots for generations. The new currency, or I should say currencies, as there were at one point in time 37 different kinds of money, from gold to silver to tortoise shell, were introduced to equalize wealth, but just caused hyperinflation that wiped out savings and created utter confusion about exchange rates and denominations. His ban on the sale of privately owned slaves, while again respectable in intent, disrupted agricultural labor, and he immediately had to reverse course and re-implement slavery. Natural disasters compound his troubles, exacerbated by agricultural policies that proved disastrous in implementation. His Zhenshen Shidu, or land equalization system, attempted to nationalize all land, redistributing it according to household size, while limiting holdings to specific amounts based on ancient Zhou models. But the bureaucratic apparatus necessary to implement such sweeping change simply didn't exist. His policies criminalized leaving fields fallow, what critics called his sloth tax, forcing continuous cultivation that depleted soil fertility within years. At the same time, his attempts to establish government monopolies on salt, iron, alcohol, and coinage created widespread market disruption that he was simply not ready to deal with the effects of. When the Yellow River shifted course twice in 5 years, leaving millions homeless, local officials couldn't respond effectively because the new administrative structures remained half implemented. Granaries, reorganized as state-owned enterprises, according to classical principles, proved too complex to manage even by the standards of the highly competent first-century Chinese bureaucracy. Wang Mang's tragedy wasn't just conceptual overreach, but implementation failure, attempting systemic transformation without the administrative capacity to manage the transition. The parallels to Augustus prove instructive in their contrasts. Both men destroyed existing systems, Augustus the Republic, Wang the established Han order. Both created new governing structures, the Principate and the Jin dynasty. But where Augustus bought off the ruling elite and allowed the lower classes enough basic luxuries, services, and freedom over belief to usher in a new system that could solidify, Wang only prodded the ruling classes into what could have been a class war that he was not prepared to fight. When he put forth broad proto-socialist policies like land reform, slavery abolition, the formation of state monopolies, and currency introduction, he was not prepared or able to mobilize the classes that he was claiming to help to his cause. And those who he was claiming to help didn't necessarily see the positive vision he was putting forward. The Chinese peasant, like most peasants in history, tends to care little for the correct theory of governance unless educated or prodded as to why that should be the case. They want predictable taxes, access to food, reliable currency, and stable land ownership, things that later philosophers might have called class interest, things that Wang Mang was not ensuring were provided. Instead, Wang seems to believe that pure virtue and classical precedent should suffice. Wang was in a way far ahead of his time and didn't possess the infrastructure and the theory needed to implement the change that he sought. But he also had his head stuck in the past, unable to be pragmatic and seemingly operating under the belief that the correct ideals would govern the country for him. As dawn breaks over Chang'an, Wang Mang rises from his texts. In the imperial audience hall, he will receive ministers bearing increasingly desperate reports. Provincial governors report armed bands of Qi Mei rebels, meaning red eyebrows, for the manner in which they paint their faces. They're peasants who've been driven to banditry by famine and currency collapse. Military commanders describe mutinies among troops paid in worthless new coins. Officials plead for pragmatic compromises to his reform program, but Wang will respond as he always has, by quoting the classics, by insisting that proper implementation of Zhou area principles will restore harmony. Unlike Augustus, who would live to old age and die peacefully in his bed, Wang Mang's idealistic tyranny is racing toward its inevitable end. Within 8 years, rebel armies will breach Chang'an's walls. The scholar emperor will die at the hands of his subjects, his head paraded through streets lined with starving people. Wang Mang's spectacular failure profoundly shaped later Han attitudes toward reform. The Eastern Han Dynasty, that will emerge after his death as a spiritual continuation of the Western Han before him, approached economic and social problems with cautious incrementalism rather than sweeping change. Court officials would cite Wang when debating policy, using the memory of his reign to warn against disrupting established patterns too quickly. His catastrophic land reform attempts made later dynasties deeply wary of agricultural reorganization, even when inequality reached crisis levels. Rather than attempting structural transformation, they relied on tax relief, disaster assistance, and modest regulation of markets, maintaining stability at the cost of addressing the roots of fundamental problems. The idealistic reformers' failure cast a long shadow over Chinese statecraft, creating a persistent tension between Confucian ideals of just governance and practical fears of destabilization. I can almost assure you that the 20th episode of this show will feature an individual who seeks to address this contradiction after a few thousand years. The man who would eventually restore the Han Dynasty after Wang Mang's failed experiment. Liu Xiu, posthumously known as Emperor Guangwu, was in 17 CE a minor official watching events unfold. Unlike Wang Mang's idealistic vision of creating a pure Zhou-era government, Liu Xiu would build his restoration on pragmatic accommodation with land-holding elites and regional powers, balancing central authority with local autonomy. While Wang Mang attempted a revolutionary return to ancient ideals, Guangwu would create a lasting dynasty through evolutionary compromise that favored entrenched economic privilege. The contrast between these approaches, idealistic reform versus practical governance, would shape Chinese political philosophy for centuries. Leaving China now, we will return to Rome, not to the city, not in its imperial heartland nor its closest provinces, but in a far-flung former colony, now province of the East, where a new spiritual movement is coming into itself. The year is now 27 CE, the 13th year of the reign of Augustus's stepson and heir Tiberius Caesar. In the dusty backwater region of Galilee, in a Roman province known as Judea, a 31-year-old carpenter's son wades into the Jordan River. The baptizer is John, a man who would go on to be imprisoned and beheaded by Roman vassal Herod Antipas for denouncing his marriage to Herodias, his half-brother's former wife. John had earlier called the man he now baptizes the Lamb of God. The crowd gathers at a distance, maintaining necessary purity for what is in Judaism known as a ritual immersion. Yet something about this particular mikveh captures attention. Unlike other seekers of John's purification, this Yeshua does not merely emerge cleansed. According to witnesses, the heavens opened, or so the story will come to be known. The historical Yeshua Bar Yosef, the man we know to be Jesus Christ through the Gospels, grows up in a Galilee under triple occupation, Roman military control, Herodian political domination, and religious authority vested in a Sadducean priesthood that collaborates with both. His native Aramaic tongue mingles with Greek for commerce and Latin for imperial decrees. Like thousands of his generation, he carries a double identity, collaborator or rebel, traditionalist or reformer. Yet unlike most, he will seemingly find a third path, seizing the moment, either himself or through the words and actions of later followers, to build a radical reimagining of God's kingdom, one God's kingdom. It is a vision that will outlive empires. The Gospels, written decades after Jesus' death in scattered communities from Rome to Antioch, present multiple versions of the man: a miracle worker healing Roman centurions' servants, a prophet denouncing temple authorities, a wisdom teacher reinterpreting Torah, an apocalyptic herald announcing the end times. The historical figure must be reconstructed from fragments, a wandering rabbi with artisan background who attracted followers from disaffected sectors of Jewish society, tax collectors, fishermen, women, the sick, and the ritually impure. As such, while we consider the importance of Jesus, we do so not only for how the actions of his time changed society directly as Augustus or Wang Mang, but rather how the idea of the person came to shape history thereafter. While the Gospels provide our primary window into Jesus' life, limited non-Christian sources confirm his historical existence and execution. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around 116 CE, mentions Christus, who, during the reign of Tiberius, was executed by the procurator Pontius Pilate. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 90s CE, refers to Jesus was the Messiah and a wise teacher who was crucified by Pontius Pilate, in passages whose authenticity scholars continue to debate. These brief mentions from hostile or neutral sources establish the historical kernel around which gospel narratives developed. They confirm what archaeology suggests, that a Jewish teacher from Galilee gained significant following before Roman execution, with his movement surprisingly continuing rather than disappearing after his death. The historical core must be distinguished from theological interpretations, while recognizing that even the earliest accounts come from communities already convinced of his messianic status. Judea under Tiberius exemplifies imperial contradiction and the vast cultural and religious synthesis that was underway in the occupied East. In the sprawling cosmopolitan city of Jerusalem, where Greek philosophy mingles with Persian astronomy in the Agora shadows, where Roman eagles perch atop Jewish synagogues, Roman authorities grant religious autonomy while extracting tribute through local elites. The great temple Herod built, still under construction in the year 27 CE, serves as both a spiritual center and an economic machine, its courts humming with money changers converting Greek drachmas to Tyrian shekels for temple offerings. Pilgrims from Alexandria to Antioch bring wealth that flows ultimately to Rome, while Galilean peasants mortgage their fields to cover taxes both to Caesar and to temple. Roman religious policy in the eastern provinces reveals sophisticated oppression. Unlike Western territories, where Roman gods simply absorbed local deities, the monotheistic religions of Judaism and emerging mystery cults pose unique challenges. They brought with them an appeal to a more individualistic and personal approach to religion and spirituality, rather than the more cosmopolitan and mundane pantheons of the Romans. Roman authorities recognized this Jewish peculiarity, exempting them from having to worship Roman leaders as gods, allowing Sabbath observance, and protecting their proselytizing rights. Yet this tolerance allows surveillance. The high priest, appointed by Roman governors, serves as a double agent, spiritual leaders to Jews, intelligence asset to Rome. Into this tension steps Yeshua, Jesus, teaching render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, words that subsequent generations will interpret as either accommodation or subversion. Likely this is a recognition of many things, that Roman coins bearing imperial images have no place in God's kingdom, that the temple system collaborating with Rome deserves questioning, that paying taxes while preparing for God's imminent intervention creates no contradiction. His teachings resonate precisely because they address daily oppression without the need for immediate armed revolt. When Jesus heals on the Sabbath, he challenges religious authorities willing to compromise for political stability. When he eats with tax collectors like Levi, also known as Matthew, he reclaims social outcasts created by the collaboration between Jewish elites and Roman power. When he cleanses the temple, driving out money changers, he attacks the economic engine, fueling both religious and imperial authority. The Roman centurion whose servant Jesus reportedly heals represents the empire's local face, not the distant princeps or his legions, but the occupation force neighbor who might be reasonable, yet serves unreasonable masters. That Jesus apparently treats the centurion's faith as exemplary suggests his message transcended ethnic boundaries that Rome had weaponized to divide subject peoples. Women followers like Mary Magdalene, Mary and Martha of Bethany, and Salome represent another facet of social transformation. In Roman Judea, women occupy liminal spaces, excluded from temple courts, yet economically active. Jesus' acceptance of women disciples subverts both Roman patriarchy and its Jewish variant, creating communities where, as a future member of this list will add, there is neither male nor female. As with many mystics, especially those espousing messages of radical social change, the historical Jesus probably spoke in parables not merely for beauty, but for protection. Stories about seeds and soil, wealth and poverty, insiders and outsiders could be read multiple ways, as spiritual allegory to Roman authorities, as social critique to his followers. His emphasis on forgiveness of debts directly challenged the economic system, where peasants lost ancestral lands to debt collectors working for urban landlords aligned with Rome. The apocalyptic elements of Jesus' message resonated specifically under Roman occupation. His proclamations that the time has come and the kingdom of God is near spoke directly to a population experiencing imperial domination. When Jesus declared that many who are first will be last and the last first, he offered theological framework for understanding Roman rule as temporary, soon to be overturned by divine intervention. His parables about the return of a master who would judge servants based on their faithfulness during his absence created hope among the powerless without requiring immediate rebellion. The book of Revelation, written decades later during periods of Roman persecution, would develop these themes into full apocalyptic vision, where imperial power, symbolized as Babylon, faces divine judgment. This apocalyptic framework, interpreting present suffering as meaningful within a cosmic narrative where God ultimately overturns earthly power, provided psychological resistance under empire without requiring suicidal revolt. It acknowledged Roman dominance while denying its permanence or ultimate significance. Jesus' head lifts from the waters of the Jordan River. The onlookers proclaim him the Messiah, the Christos, the Anointed One. In a few short years he will be executed, and the small flame burning here today will ignite and spread like wildfire. The trial of Jesus before Pontius Pilate, historically verified by Tacitus, a source we can thank for many of the individuals in this episode, occurs within larger patterns of Roman provincial justice. Prefects like Pilate generally care little for internal Jewish religious disputes, but respond decisively to any threat to imperial order. That the charge becomes king of the Jews rather than blasphemy shows how religious claims translate into political charges. Crucifixion itself, reserved for slaves and political rebels, sends clear messages to local populations. And so the death that would have ended his influence becomes its catalyst. Within days of crucifixion, followers claim resurrection, not mere spiritual survival, but bodily vindication of everything that Rome killed. These claims spread with surprising speed through networks of synagogues and philosophical schools already linking Mediterranean cities. The message resonates with multiple audiences: Jews seeking messianic fulfillment, Greeks exploring new philosophies, Romans questioning empty imperial cults. By century's end, Christian communities exist in major cities throughout the empire. They attract converts from all social strata: educated slaves, artisan householders, upper-class women. These groups' meetings, marked by shared meals, mutual aid, and studied detachment from imperial cults, concern Roman authorities enough to draw occasional persecution. Yet the movement's emphasis on obedience to earthly authorities, except where they conflict with divine commands, prevents systematic repression. Rome executes rebels regularly. Most die forgotten. This one's death becomes the date that splits history, the story that transforms the region, the symbol that will come to define resistance to, collaboration with, and building of empires for centuries to come. The historical Jesus and the Christ of faith remain forever inseparable and not fully knowable. But what is known is that one specific life lived under Roman domination will become universally meaningful while remaining historically very particular. The life of Jesus is not the only one illustrative of the strange and syncretic contradictions that were emerging in various parts of the Roman Empire. Just a couple provinces over in Roman Egypt, a Hellenic Jew will make a contribution that will resonate with future followers of Christ for millennia, despite the two never meeting. (39 CE), somewhere in the Mediterranean. Aboard the creaking merchant vessel, Philo of Alexandria sits in quiet prayer. He is one of the greatest Jewish minds of his era and has spent his life working to reconcile Jewish tradition with Greek philosophy. He travels to the grand city of Rome for the first time. He is set off as part of an embassy to meet the Roman emperor, technically still known as princeps. This princeps, let's just say emperor, is known colloquially as Caligula, a nickname meaning little boots, gained as a child for following his general father around the German front dressed as a tiny legionnaire. Philo sails to Caligula now to attempt to explain to him that Jews like himself pray for the emperor, for his well-being, for his health, and for his achievements, and in that way worship him themselves. Philo does that now, setting his mind to his quiet and meditative prayer, blocking out the sounds of swearing sailors above deck and some of the seasick passengers below. The man has managed to bring one of his scrolls from the Library of Alexandria, the Septuagint, a translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. The dusty thing is his most prized possession, and he reads through passages intermittently with prayer. On this ship, Philo may be out of his element, and in Rome, despite tremendous rhetorical skill, he will be too. But at 59 years old, Philo of Alexandria is respected to the utmost degree in his eponymous hometown among both the city's large Jewish population and its Greek intellectual elite. His younger brother, the wealthy Aladac Alexander, manages finances for the Roman prefect, but Philo himself pursues a different form of power, reconciling Moses with Plato, Torah with Logos, Jewish particularity with Hellenistic universalism. He is a scholar, a mystic, and now an advocate for his people. The man contemplates his purpose in appealing to the Roman princeps. While he and his brother might be personally wealthy and successful, the same cannot be said for Alexandria's estimated to be roughly 100,000 Jews, twice the population of Jerusalem's. The population may speak Greek rather than Aramaic, but they face potential pogrom and oppression just the same. Unlike their brethren in the Holy Land, Alexandrian Jews participate fully in civic life, serving as gymnasiarches, who train athletes, studying rhetoric, and attending philosophical lectures, conducting business deals that fund imperial grain shipments throughout the empire. Yet their privilege depends on maintaining ritual purity, paying temple taxes to Jerusalem, and resisting the imperial cult's growing demands. In particular, the demand to worship the emperor as divine, something directly in contradiction with a proclaimed monotheistic faith. Philo's philosophical project, demonstrating Torah's harmony with Greek philosophy, served both intellectual synthesis and practical diplomacy. Central to his work was his innovative concept of the Logos, which he developed far beyond the Stoic notion of universal reason. For Philo, the Logos represents God's creative power and intermediary presence in the material world, the divine reason that brought order from chaos and connected the transcendent creator to creation. This concept brilliantly bridged Jewish monotheism with Greek philosophical needs for cosmological explanation. When Philo describes Moses as a living law, embodying divine reason, he translated Jewish particularity into universalistic terms that Greeks could appreciate. When he interpreted biblical figures allegorically, seeing Abraham's journey as the soul's progress towards wisdom, or Israel's exodus as liberation from passions, he transformed scripture into philosophical narrative. These interpretive methods would provide early Christian thinkers with tools to explain their faith to Greco-Roman audiences, while his concept of logos would directly influence the Gospel of John's prologue. Quote, "In the beginning was the Word," logos. Philo thus created a conceptual framework that enabled monotheistic traditions to engage with Hellenistic intellectual culture without abandoning their fundamental principles. In Alexandria, these logical arguments and practiced mysticism have won Philo renown. In Rome, in front of the emperor, they will be utterly useless. For the emperor Gaius Caligula, the great-grandson of Augustus, is less interested in Greek philosophy and is more interested in, according to the words of our primary historians and reported urban legends, orgies, a self-appointment to godhood, declaring war on Neptune, the god, not the planet, and making his horse a consul. Caligula now demands divine honors throughout the eastern provinces, including of the monotheistic Jews, and Philo will come to find that his two worlds are colliding violently, despite his lifelong attempts to find harmony between them. By 37 CE, the same year that Caligula ascends the throne, Philo's treatises had already reimagined the story of Exodus as an allegory of the soul's liberation from passion, and framed Sabbath observance as a Stoic exercise in cosmic harmony. His synthesis was not merely an abstraction. Alexandria's Jews, potentially a third of the city, depended on such intellectual diplomacy to justify their dual identity as both torchbearers of Torah and stakeholders in an empire whose grain fleets their merchants financed. When Caligula's demand for divine worship reached Alexandria in 38 CE, Greek mobs exploited the edict to ignite violent pogroms. Statues of the emperor were erected in synagogues. Jewish elders were flogged in theaters for refusing sacrifices. Philo, widely considered a leader of the Jewish semi-autonomous community known as a politeuma, documented the horror. Quote, and maybe tune this bit out if you are faint of heart. The most merciless of all their persecutors, in some instances, burnt whole families, husbands with their wives, and infant children with their parents, in the middle of the city, sparing neither age nor youth, nor the innocent helplessness of infants. Philo witnessed intellectuals who debated Aristotle in the morning, leading anti-Jewish riots by nightfall. The philosophical cosmopolitanism that he championed proved fragile against ethnic violence. This was why Philo was aboard the ship to meet with Caligula. And so, despite his advanced age, Philo leads the Jewish contingent of this delegation to Rome, and it provides his first sight of the capital that controls his fate. When he eventually does stand before Caligula in the imperial gardens, he will briefly attempt the allegory and the argument he was so well known for in Alexandria, explaining how Jewish prayers for the emperor constitute real worship. But the mad emperor will only mock him, and monotheism generally, asking why Jews refuse to acknowledge his divinity, and threatening to put statues of himself in the Temple of Jerusalem. It would be no sooner than Philo merely entered the presence of the madman emperor, Caligula, that he would realize that the entirety of his mission there was a waste of time. Relationships between Jews in Alexandria and Rome had been fairly good under Augustus and Tiberius, but after Philo's meeting with Caligula, it was clear that the days of these harmonious relationships were numbered. The embassy would return mostly a failure, with one minor positive being that Caligula's assassination by his own Praetorian Guard would mean no official persecution for Philo or the broader Jewish community. But the experience reshapes Philo's understanding. His later works emphasize divine mystery over philosophical systematization, Jewish particularity over universal reason. He recognizes that Hellenistic culture's inclusivity has its limits. When push comes to shove, Jews remain eternal foreigners in cities that they've inhabited for generations. Yet Philo's legacy transcends this political failure. His method of allegorical interpretation will influence early Christians, allowing them to find philosophical profundity in biblical narratives. His concept of word, logos, as divine intermediary provides vocabulary for John's Gospel prologue. His description of ascetic communities anticipates monastic traditions. Ironically, this most Greek of Jews becomes more influential among Christians than within Judaism's mainstream. As the decade ends, Philo ages in Alexandria's intellectual ferment, writing treatises that blend biblical commentary with philosophical dialogue. Back in the Rome that he visited once and will never again return to, the long-dead Caligula has a relative who is reshaping the empire by a combination of genius yet villainous feats of intrigue and diplomacy, carving out power for herself despite working against a patriarchal structure designed for her to fail. (49 CE). Inside a grand reception hall atop the Palatine Hill, the 34-year-old empress-in-waiting sits perfectly still, her expression a blend of poise and dignity. Her uncle is 25 years her senior, as he brings her his wedding gifts. A range of ornate perfume bottles, full of scents from basil to almond to rose. She has pushed for this moment, and it has finally come. The stuttering old man walks toward her, and she is about to wed him. A niece marrying an uncle was almost as bizarre and discomforting a scenario to ancient Romans as it is today. But on paper, if what you care most of all about is bloodlines, Agrippina was the perfect candidate for her uncle, Emperor Claudius. After all, hers is the blood of a true Julio-Claudian. Her maternal great-grandfather was Augustus. Her father was the great general Germanicus, often seen as a Roman emperor who never was, and her brother was the late Emperor Caligula, who has just been offed by his own Praetorian Guard due to his excesses. The blood of greatness flows through her veins, and she sees herself as no exception. It is New Year's Day, the perfect day for a marriage to honor Janus and signify new beginnings, a day to look forward to the future. Agrippina's future is bright, for she will not only be empress by marriage to Claudius, but she will one day come to be empress again as the mother of a child emperor. And yet on this mild winter day, there are very few souls here to celebrate, for this marriage would have been illegal only a year ago, but the Emperor Claudius has changed the law so as to unite their fates. Despite the change in legality of the niece and uncle marrying, the people of Rome are generally displeased due to the taboo nature, and the family has decided not to allow the public due to the potential for unrest. As such, the hall is quiet and near empty. Agrippina the Younger is a woman of Rome, tutored by her mother Agrippina the Elder, as well as Augustus's own wife and the most powerful woman in Roman history, Livia, and a cohort of other strong and powerful women in the Roman courts. She understands clearly that the rules and the naysayers are meant to prevent her from achieving the power she so desires by way of her gender, but she also understands that she can play her own games to gain it anyway, by way of her blood and her brilliance. Now she finally ascends to Empress herself, not her father, not her great-grandfather, not her brother, herself. But Agrippina's goals go beyond herself. She eats with the man and the boy who will be her gateways to formal power. Claudius can allow her some of the agency she craves, but her son, Lucius Domitius Enobarbus, soon to be Nero, was her more long-term project. He would be emperor. He would be Claudius's heir, despite Claudius having a son of his own. In fact, it was only hours after marrying Claudius that Agrippina would make her first move to dismantle any obstacles to her son's advancement. Her first target was a man by the name of Lucius Junius Silanus, then engaged to Claudius's daughter Octavia. Through political maneuvering involving false accusations of incest, a classic Roman slander and potentially ironic given the circumstances, she had Silanus dealt with. While Claudius and Agrippina are enjoying their beautiful wedding day, Lucius Junius Silanus is being forced to kill himself. This first act would make way for Agrippina's cherished boy Nero to eventually marry his own stepsister and cousin, Octavia, further securing the bloodline. Soon, Agrippina would achieve her hard-earned landmark victory, Nero's formal adoption by Claudius, effectively placing him above Claudius's own son Britannicus in the line of succession, despite being only 3 years older and not his blood son. The systematic marginalization of Britannicus proceeded methodically. Tutors and his guards were replaced with Agrippina's loyalists, effectively placing the boy under house arrest within the palace. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite military unit, and the emperor's personal protectors, saw its leadership overhauled with the appointment of Sextus Afrianus Burrus, Agrippina's ally. This ensured that when the moment of succession came, military support would align with her plans. Coins minted in 51 CE visually reinforced this new hierarchy, featuring Nero prominently while Britannicus was conspicuously absent, a telling insight into how Roman coinage was used to so explicitly communicate succession politics. Perhaps most ingeniously, Agrippina cultivated intellectual heavyweights to legitimize her son's claim. She recalled Seneca the Younger, an emergent side character for the coming decades, from exile to become Nero's tutor, ensuring her son received training in rhetoric and philosophy from Rome's foremost intellectual, while Britannicus remained siloed away in a dark corner of the imperial palace. This alliance with Seneca, a Stoic philosopher with connections throughout the senatorial class, provided crucial legitimacy and created the image of Nero as a philosophically inclined princeps who would restore Augustan values. Agrippina's marriage to Claudius would end with his dramatic and controversial death in 54 CE. The traditional account from Tacitus and Suetonius involves poisoned mushrooms, with the story elaborating that when he was not dying quickly enough, a physician employed by Agrippina forced a poisoned feather down his throat, ostensibly to induce vomiting, but actually to finish the job. So modern historians have noted several problems with this account. Alternative explanations suggest natural causes. So Claudius was 63 with declining health and documented gastrointestinal problems throughout his life. Some scholars propose accidental food poisoning from contaminated mushrooms, while others suggest a cerebrovascular event consistent with symptoms described in ancient sources. However, the timing, just as Britannicus approached manhood and could challenge Nero's position, naturally aroused suspicion, but conclusive evidence remains elusive. What is certain is that Agrippina's preparations ensured Nero's smooth succession regardless of how his predecessor died, with the Praetorians proclaiming him emperor while Britannicus remained isolated in the palace. The convenient timing benefited Agrippina so perfectly that suspicions, naturally, would fall upon her. but whether she hastened an inevitable death or simply exploited natural circumstances remains one of history's unresolved questions. Agrippina's influence peaked in Nero's early reign. She received the unprecedented title of Augusta, a name only having been bestowed once before to the then long-dead Livia, wife of Augustus. She sat beside Nero at public functions, received foreign delegations, and even attempted to join him in receiving the Armenian delegation in the lead-up to the Roman-Parthian War, stopped only when Seneca advised Nero that allowing his mother on the imperial dais would shock Roman sensibilities. This power proved unsustainable. By 55 CE, Nero would begin to assert independence, encouraged by Seneca and Burrus, who shifted loyalties from mother to son. Agrippina's response, threatening to support Britannicus of all things, likely sealed the young prince's fate. He died suddenly at a dinner party in February 55 CE, almost certainly poisoned by his stepbrother Nero's agents, the young emperor beginning to take after his mother. With her leverage diminished, Agrippina's influence declined rapidly. The final break came over Nero's affair with a woman named Poppaea Sabina. Agrippina opposed the relationship, recognizing that it threatened both her influence and the political alliance with the Claudian line represented by Octavia. One ancient source claims Agrippina attempted to seduce Nero to regain control, almost certainly a fabrication reflecting the Roman inability to conceive of female power except through sexuality. More plausibly, she threatened to support alternative claimants to the throne. Whatever the case, Nero's response was to meet her with the same courtly assassination plays that she met her opponents with. In 59 CE, after failed assassination attempts, including apparently multiple poisonings, a bed designed to crush her with its canopy, and an elaborate collapsible boat designed to drown her, not knowing that she could swim, yes, this is all real, he finally dispatched simple assassins to off his mother at her villa. The ancient sources give her a tremendously dramatic ending. Quote, "Smite my womb, strike here for this born Nero." It's probably made up. It's certainly apocryphal, but it's also absolute entertainment. That's the Romans. And in any case, the woman who had bent Rome's political machinery to her will was ultimately destroyed by the son whose power she had engineered. Agrippina's strategic marriages illustrate how women navigated imperial politics through family alliances when direct power was denied them. Her first marriage to Gnaeus Domitius Aenobarbus connected her to an ancient patrician family, while her second to the wealthy Gaius Sallustius Crispus Passienus secured financial resources. Her culminating marriage to her uncle Claudius, requiring special senatorial dispensation to override incest prohibitions, represents the pinnacle of dynastic calculation. These marriages weren't merely personal arrangements, but political realignments, shifting networks of patronage, wealth, and influence between competing factions. Throughout the Julio-Claudian period, strategic marriages created and dissolved alliances more effectively than formal agreements, with women serving as both agents and tokens in these exchanges. Agrippina's manipulation of this system reveals both its functioning and its contradictions, a society that officially restricted women to domestic roles while unofficially acknowledging their political influence through familial connections. Her story demonstrates how imperial politics operated through overlapping networks of kinship rather than merely through formal institutions, with marriage functioning as political technology for consolidating power. Agrippina's machinations reveal the structural instability of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the Roman imperial system itself. Without formal mechanisms for succession beyond the emperor's personal choice, power transfers remained vulnerable to manipulation by those with proximity to the throne. The regular eruptions of assassination, conspiracy, and familial betrayal weren't merely personal dramas, but were systemic failures in a state that maintained republican facades while functioning as hereditary monarchy. Agrippina exploited this fundamental contradiction, leveraging both republican institutions like the Senate, magistracies, priesthoods, and dynastic claims, blood relations to Augustus as one, to advance her agenda. Her ability to navigate this hybrid system, simultaneously working through official channels while arranging murders, exposed how the Principate's careful constitutional fictions concealed raw power politics. Each imperial transition generated crisis precisely because Augustus had created a system dependent on individual character rather than institutional checks, making proximity to the emperor through blood, marriage, or sexual relationship the primary path to influence. This vulnerability would plague Rome for centuries, leading to a later period of Rome where only 25% of emperors would die from natural causes. Agrippina now drinks wine and feasts with her family and closest advisors. She celebrates her future with her new husband, who she will probably one day go on to kill, and her son, who will probably one day go on to kill her, and subsequently end the power of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, being deposed in 68 CE and making way for a new dynasty, the Flavians, in Rome. In 49 CE, the same year as the wedding, a Jewish religious leader was to be summoned to Jerusalem to address growing tensions between Jewish and Gentile followers of Jesus. How he would respond and how he would change would define a new religion for the next 2 millennia. A couple of years later, he has traveled once more along Rome's extensive highway networks to a city in modern-day Greece. '51 CE, in the open air of the Corinthian Agora in Roman Achaia, Greece. A 46-year-old tent-maker named Paul, citizen of Tarsus, trained in Jerusalem, converted on Damascus Road, chats and works in a workshop near the Temple of Aphrodite. His hands, calloused from working similar goat hair canvas all his life, are steady despite his evangelizing and discussing philosophy with customers. Paul views himself as performing 2 jobs right now. First, his tent making, but second, and much more importantly to him, acting as a missionary of Jesus Christ. Paul speaks of his own experience with the divine as a proof of Jesus, how on that road to Damascus, the dead Messiah appeared to him in a blinding light and asked him why Paul, then Saul, persecuted him. Paul does not speak much of these days about his time working to persecute this now Jesus-worshipping sect of Jews, nor does he fondly remember his old name Saul. Paul, like Agrippina, is looking forward to the future, attempting to convince others to convert in the same way that he has. He's not founding a new religion per se, but creating new rules and definitions, and uprooting old ones which will pave the way for the religion's vast success in this Roman Empire, and many more. Recent expulsion from Rome under Claudius's decree in the same year as the emperor's marriage to Agrippina has left much of the Jewish community in the Mediterranean unsettled. Hellenistic merchants, foreign philosophers, and native craftsmen mix in cosmopolitan tension here in Corinth. Paul's arrival, traveling with wealthy companions Priscilla and Aquila, now co-workers both in tent-making and proselytizing, disturbs this balance further. Every Sabbath finds Paul in Corinth's synagogue, arguing that Jesus of Nazareth, executed under Pontius Pilate, fulfills prophetic promise of many Jewish believers and sects. The Greek-speaking Jews initially welcome this debate. Some recognize sophistication in Paul's interpretive methods, but his core message, the thing that sets Paul apart from even most disciples who knew Jesus in his lifetime, that Gentiles receive God's covenant without circumcision or other ritual purifications, threatens communal boundaries and Jewish law maintained for generations. When Jewish opposition intensifies, Paul declares, "From now on I will go preach to the Gentiles." His strategic move to the house of Titius Justus, a God-fearer living next door to the synagogue, according to Paul's words in the New Testament, represents calculated provocation. Converting the synagogue ruler Crispus and his entire household, Paul establishes parallel community that disrupts traditional religious geography. Weekly gatherings feature distinctive rituals: shared meal followed by teachings, money collected for Jerusalem's poor, letters read from other communities stretching from Syrian Antioch to European Philippi. Paul's navigation between Jewish identity and universal message reveals the internal tensions within this revolutionary project. As a Pharisee trained, quote, at the feet of Rabbi Gamaliel, Paul remained deeply committed to Jewish theological concepts, monotheism, covenant, scripture, messianic hope, while radically reinterpreting their boundaries. His letter to the Romans carefully balances affirmation that salvation is from the Jews, with insistence that God's promises now extend to all nations. This tension emerges most clearly in his confrontation with Peter, someone that we will discuss briefly later, at Antioch, where Paul publicly challenges the senior apostle for withdrawing from shared meals with Gentile believers. For Paul, commensality, the act of eating together, became theologically significant, a visible demonstration that old barriers had been broken. Yet the same Paul, who opposed circumcising Gentile converts, continued to observe Jewish customs himself, have Timothy circumcised for pragmatic reasons, and take Nazirite vows. This complex negotiation between particularity and universality was not merely theoretical, but intensely practical. Could Jews and Gentiles form unified communities without either group abandoning its identity? Paul's communities became laboratories for this experiment, developing practices that maintained connection to Jewish roots while accommodating Gentile participation, creating something simultaneously continuous with and distinct from both Judaism and Greco-Roman religion. During 18 months in Corinth, Paul writes to Thessalonian converts, addressing their anxiety about delayed parousia, Christ's expected return. The letter's arrival by courier occasions public reading in the assembled ecclesia, creating models for Christian liturgy and biblical canon simultaneously. There's an interesting through line here, all the way from Augustus, as Paul is using the infrastructure of the Roman cursus publicus, the post office, to achieve his letter-writing feats. And although Paul himself is not quite a Philo of Alexandria in scholarly acumen, Paul's Greek prose, mixing Septuagint quotations with historical techniques learned through his travels, shapes religious language for generations. The proconsul Gallio, brother to Seneca the Younger, hears Jewish complaints against Paul but dismisses them as internal theological dispute. This legal precedent, Roman officials viewing Christianity as a Jewish sect rather than a distinct cult, provides protection across provinces. Paul exploits this ambiguity masterfully, leveraging citizenship rights while establishing communities that will gradually separate from synagogue authority. His gospel message carries political edge, declaring Jesus Lord directly challenges the imperial cult, naming Caesar Kyrios, the Greek for Lord. Propagating Jesus' apocalyptic reversal where first becomes last and last first subverts social hierarchies maintained by Roman power. Yet Paul also counsels obedience to authorities, paying taxes and accepting slavery's existence, pragmatic accommodation, preventing premature persecution. Paul's theology directly engaged with imperial realities, offering an alternative political framework disguised as religious teaching. His concept of the ecclesia, typically translated as church but actually meaning assembly, deliberately evoked political gatherings, suggested an alternative civic community with different organizing principles. When Paul wrote that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, he outlined a revolutionary social vision that subverted Roman social hierarchies while avoiding direct confrontation with imperial authority. His emphasis on Christ's victory over, quote, principalities and powers used deliberately ambiguous language that followers could understand as referring to spiritual forces or earthly governments. By describing Jesus as Lord, Kyrios, and Savior, Soter, terms used in imperial propaganda for Caesar, Paul created subversive parallel between imperial claims and supposed divine reality. His eschatological framework, anticipating Christ's return to establish divine kingdom, effectively relativized Roman power by presenting it as temporary, soon to be superseded by higher authority. This theological approach allowed Christian communities to maintain critical distance from imperial values while avoiding the suicidal path of open rebellion. The philosophical schools of Corinth noticed this new teacher. Unlike Stoics pursuing individual virtue or Epicureans seeking pleasure, Paul proclaims corporeal salvation, bodily resurrection, and divine grace rather than human achievement. His emphasis on faith, pistis, over works, echoes Hellenistic trust in divine providence while radically redirecting its objective. Letters become theological treatises debating Gentile inclusion, sexual ethics, proper worship, and resurrection's meaning. Traveling throughout Greece, Paul faces opposition from multiple angles: Jewish traditionalists, rival teachers of different followers of Christ, craftsmen fearing economic loss from temple decline, civic authorities suspicious of unregistered associations. At Ephesus, His preaching causes a riot when silversmiths realize that widespread conversion threatens their trade in Artemis statuettes. Paul has a lifelong list of enemies, but his strategy adapts constantly, appealing to Hebrew scripture with Jewish audiences, philosophical argumentations with Greeks, citizenship rights with Romans. The decade's middle years find Paul shifting base to Ephesus, capital of Asia province. From there, he oversees correspondence with churches throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The Galatian correspondence defends his apostolic authority against those demanding Gentile circumcision in accordance with Jewish law around ritual purity. Paul's epistle to the Romans, written to a community that he's not yet visited, presents systematic exposition of salvation theology. His letter carries crisscross along imperial road networks, bearing parchments that create ecclesiastical bureaucracy paralleling Roman administration. Timothy serves as personal representative. Titus handles difficult church conflicts. Phoebe carries credentials as deaconess, positions emerging from practical necessity rather than theoretical planning. The cellular structure that Paul establishes, small house churches linked by letters and traveling apostles, enables rapid growth while remaining largely invisible to imperial surveillance. Yet it's only through those imperial roads and infrastructure that Paul's subversive message may spread. Imprisonment becomes normal for Paul. Paul writes from prison cells in multiple cities, adapting captivity into advantage. Philippian guards convert after his preaching apparently predicts or coincides with an earthquake. Ephesian imprisonment produces a letter carried by Onesimus, Philemon's runaway slave, whose return Paul negotiates while questioning slavery itself. When Paul does finally make it to Rome, he finds himself under house arrest again fairly quickly. Yet that will only serve to allow him continued teaching with imperial permission, apparently even reaching Caesar's household, according to his own claims. His theology wrestles with practical questions. Can Gentile converts eat marketplace meat potentially offered to idols? Should women be able to practice prophecy unveiled? Does spiritual gift-giving create hierarchy or equality? These decisions shape Christianity's daily expression and boundary maintenance. They determine what will be seen as Christian or unchristian. Paul's compromises, not fully Jewish, but certainly not pagan, establish something new. As the decade ends, Paul prepares for what might potentially be his final Jerusalem visit. Carrying financial aid collected through Gentile churches for the poor among the saints, he understands this may provoke fatal opposition. His farewells to Ephesian elders express conviction that spirit-driven ministry continues beyond individual apostles. The torch passes as younger leaders, Timothy, Titus, Priscilla, Aquila, assume responsibility for established communities. The transformation Paul effects proves unprecedented. From a small Galilean renewal movement emerges an international religious organization, combining Jewish monotheism with Hellenistic mission strategy. His letters, copied and circulated widely by century's end, become scripture, alongside Torah and the prophets. The tentmaker from Tarsus, through personal charisma and literary legacy, shapes religious landscape more profoundly than any emperor. Paul looks up briefly from his work to smile at the couple before they leave, beckoning them to return in the future and discuss more if they're so interested. His strategy would lead him to imprisonment and persecution, but would keep him around for long enough to spread his message far and wide. The message will allow the religion to speak to the wealthy and to the impoverished, to the Jew and to the Gentile, to the man and to the woman. Whereas Jesus and Philo found that they came up against a Roman Empire that would find its way to silence them eventually, Paul has discovered a way in, whether he knows it or not. This creates a future where he and the other followers of Christ might be able to shape the Roman Empire to be one which not only accepts Christ, but propagates a Christian message. Far across the stretches of that empire, in the most westerly hinterland, there exists another people, almost entirely unrelated to those in Paul's world in every way, except for their having to deal with the same oppressive, imperial Roman bureaucracy. '61 CE. The woman is tall, flame-haired, and her voice pierces like a trumpet. She stands before her peers, but they look to her as leader, as queen. As Boudica bellows to the tribal representatives gathered in a once quiet oak grove, she surveys them. They come from all sorts of families, tribes of all stripe. Now, they meet outside of the Roman colonia of Camalodunum, a place one day to be known as Colchester, England. They're here to put aside tribal differences and prepare to fight against an existential threat to all of them. Many of the men before her remind Boudica of her late husband, Procidigus, a man who had been king of the Iceni, but a client to the Roman conquerors, attempting to secure his family's future through subservience. Upon his death, his will divided the kingdom between his daughters and the Roman Emperor Nero equally, but the Romans ignored this, treating Emperor Nero as sole recipient of any claims in the will. It was a prefect named Catus Decianus who then ordered immediate annexation of this Iceni, pillaging of the countryside, ransacking of the king's household. As Tacitus tells us, members of the army brutally flogged Boudica, did terrible things to her daughters that you can look up if you choose, enslaved local nobles, and seized property. Other sources tell us that it was loans, given personally by Seneca the Younger, the now advisor to Nero, which the Celtic tribes took to be gifts, that have now been recalled by the scholar in Rome and have led to this unrest. It may be that both of these stories contain some truth. In either case, the violations are criminal to the Iceni and the other Britons, and they have catalyzed a rage building across Britannia since Roman occupation began 2 decades earlier. Roman veterans have settled in Camalodunum. In the eyes of many of the warriors gathered here today, the same violent thugs who have trespassed in this land now are in the process of transforming a former tribal capital into a place of luxury for themselves. They have seized ancestral lands, imposed crushing taxes, and conscripted youths for auxiliary service. Even those legionnaires who once served alongside Iceni warriors, maybe even treated them well and with dignity, now evict them from villages to establish farms or mines worked by local labor. In the southern city of Londinium, a recently founded trading post on the Thames River, Roman merchants profit from British exports: grain, silver, tin, hunting dogs, and slaves. The point of Britannia as a province to Rome is plunder, extraction, as raw and cruel as it gets in these years of the empire. Meanwhile, traditional British society, a vast and interconnected network of Celtic Briton tribes, has begun to fracture under colonial pressure. Warrior aristocracy has lost its purpose now that warfare has become rebellion. Druidic priesthood faces persecution. Tribal bonds weaken by the destruction of communal property concepts. The Latin language and Roman coins increasingly dominate marketplaces, where ancestors traded without currency or expected to share all that was gained from the land with the entire group by complex social and political bonds. The Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus has headed west to conquer the island known as Mona, one day called Anglesey in the northwest of Wales, and has successfully stamped out its resistance, harboring headquarters of powerful druids. Boudica knows that the governor and his military force have gone from this part of eastern Britain now, and so has hatched her plan to strike. Her first goal was to, with as much haste as possible, reach out to and convince these other tribal leaders, some members of the Iceni like herself, but also Trinovantes, and many from other tribes who would otherwise be at best wary allies. But the words flow freely from her, and her story moves her comrades. Her war speech, by way of Tacitus, declares, "We British are used to women commanders in war. I am descended from mighty men, but I'm not fighting for my kingdom and wealth now. I'm fighting as an ordinary person for my lost freedom, my bruised body, and my outraged daughters. Consider how many of you are fighting and why. Then you will win this battle or perish. That is what I, a woman, plan to do. Let the men live in slavery if they will." These words are undoubtedly inventions of our good friend Tacitus to fabricate an epic tale of resistance that would do well for his domestic audience in Rome. But what is fact is that Celtic warriors, aligned across tribal lines without much precedent to that point, would be so motivated so as to stream forward into battle in revenge against the settled Roman soldiers, first in Camalodunum. Boudica's revolt has begun. The first strike is decisive. With the governor away with his legions, Camalodunum is a thinly defended veteran colony. The great temple of Claudius, an imposing symbol of the late husband of our old friend Agrippina, becomes a final refuge before Boudica's warriors burn it to the ground. Archaeological evidence confirms ancient accounts. Ash layers preserve destruction dates precisely through coincidental pieces of broken pottery and coin hoards hidden by desperate citizens before fleeing. Moving quickly, and with victory in their sails, Boudica's massed forces move south to Londinium. While the governor Suetonius manages to rush himself from Wales to meet the attack at the city, he finds that he's lacking the forces and the infrastructure needed to mount a defense and chooses not to engage. Built for commerce, not warfare, lacking walls, Londinium's population of mostly Roman legionaries and merchants runs or sets sail to the province of Gaul as Boudica's horde approaches. The destruction is systematic. Temples burned, villas demolished, infrastructure destroyed. Excavations reveal the fire damage 3 feet deep in places, human remains showing indiscriminate slaughter. Estimates suggest 70,000 deaths between Camalodunum, Londinium, and the nearby Verulamium, modern-day St. Albans. The British force would demonstrate sophisticated organization. Multiple tribes coordinate movements, maintain supply lines, divide spoils according to custom. Women fight alongside men. Chariots supplement infantry. Captive Romans experience tortures traditionally reserved for sacrifices to Celtic gods, piercing, flaying, crucifixion in sacred groves. Yet the early successes of Boudica and her revolt contain in them the seeds of future failure. The Romans reorganize and reform in places where Roman forces are typically successful, in the field. Suetonius returns from Wales with battle-hardened legions, choosing confrontation sites very carefully. Narrow fields with forest behind them, negating British numerical advantage while maximizing Roman discipline. Final battle, a location debated by historians but certainly taking place in a narrow passage with a wood behind the Romans and an open field in front of them, demonstrates the technological gap between the societies, but also the effectiveness of a professional standing army and the importance of good and patient battle tactics. It also demonstrates a potential effect of earlier Roman administrative policy. Another of the inciting factors of this revolt is that policy was that the Romans had previously issued confiscation orders for weapons owned by any Britons. So this force, large as it was, may have been enormously underarmed and underarmored. And it may have been made up of tribal people from all aspects of life, including children, the elderly, and those without much fighting experience. British chariots and undisciplined charges met with Roman shield walls, pilum javelin volleys, and were then hacked down by gladius swords. When the British lines broke, encircling wagons and cavalry would trap families following the army. Roman accounts claim 80,000 British dead against 400 legionaries. Numbers that are likely inflated, but undoubtedly a devastating defeat for Boudica. Boudica reportedly takes poison rather than face capture. Her daughters vanish from record, perhaps dying in battle, perhaps surviving to live obscure lives under Roman occupation. The rebellion's aftermath brings temporary military rule, then gradual Romanization accelerates as lessons had been learned by the Romans' initial stinging defeats. We will return to what that looks like shortly, but for now we consider how Boudica's legacy proves to be dual, a cautionary tale to resistors who will be forced into the adoption of guerrilla warfare in the future, and an inspirational symbol for national consciousness centuries later. If her revolt failed militarily, it succeeded psychologically by making Romans reconsider colonial policies. The grievances that fueled Boudica's revolt echo across Roman frontiers, revealing systemic patterns of imperial exploitation that plagued provincial populations throughout the empire. Just as Arminius, or Hermann, had led Germanic tribes against Varus's legions in the Teutoburg forest in 9th CE, and just as Tacfarinas had mounted guerrilla resistance in North Africa. From 17 to 24 CE, Boudica's uprising represented indigenous response to Roman extractive practices. The specific triggers, land seizure, forced loans, sexual violence, enslavement, appear with remarkable consistency from Gaul to Syria, Spain to Egypt. Roman provincial administration functioned primarily to extract resources through taxation, conscription, and resource exploitation, with civilizing infrastructure serving this purpose rather than local needs. Roads facilitated troop movement and tax collection. Colonial settlements housed veterans who supervised native labor. Temples to Roman gods demonstrated cultural supremacy while collecting offerings. The regular pattern of conquest followed by rebellion followed by reconquest appears throughout Roman history not as exception but as structural feature. The inevitable friction between extractive imperial center and exploited periphery. Boudica's rebellion thus represents not an isolated incident, but manifestation of contradiction embedded in the imperial project itself. This pattern would continue beyond Rome. reappearing in later colonial empires that similarly justified exploitation through narratives of civilization and progress. There's a final piece of this colonialism jigsaw that we need to assemble whenever an emperor with a written historical record that has been canonized colonizes a society with an oral tradition. The pre-Roman British were primarily oral cultures whose druids prohibited writing sacred knowledge, leaving no indigenous written records of their experience. The Romans, as we know, wrote down a lot, and they did so in their own voices, ascribing their own motivations to others, including the ones they fought and conquered. This asymmetrical evidence creates fundamental challenges. We see Boudica almost exclusively through Roman eyes, described in Latin categories, interpreted through Roman political frameworks. The heroic barbarian trope served Roman literary purposes, providing moral counterpoint to imperial corruption, but obscured actual indigenous perspectives. Modern reconstructions must therefore acknowledge these limitations, while recognizing that the scale and coordination of the revolt indicates sophisticated political organization and communication networks among British tribes that belies Roman portrayal of them as primitive. The silences in our sources speak volumes about how imperial powers control historical narratives by literally writing their opponents out of history, except as foils for their own storytelling. We remain in Roman Britain for this next individual. He is the great administrator in charge of implementing infrastructural reforms and overseeing a Roman frontier that will be turned into a fully fledged province. It is 79 CE as the sun rises over the northern frontier of Roman Britain. A man stands tall against the morning sky, surveying the misty hills of what will one day be called Scotland. At 39 years old, Gnaeus Julius Agricola has a weathered face and calculating eyes. His cloak flutters in the damp highland wind as he studies the terrain before him. Not as a tourist admiring natural beauty, but as a general mapping the next phase of Roman expansion. When he was given this job 2 years prior, Agricola was told this place was the end of the world, but it seems to just keep going, harsher and harsher the further he pushes. Behind him stands a small retinue, engineers with measuring tools, aides carrying maps, and a personal guard of hardened legionnaires. They have come far beyond the last permanent Roman fortifications to chart the feasibility of military roads, the locations of native settlements, and most importantly, the strategic positions for new forts. Agricola's finger traces an invisible line across the landscape. Here, a chain of garrisons will one day connect the Forth and Clyde estuaries, creating a physical boundary between civilized Roman Britannia and the barbarian Caledonian North. For the new governor of Britannia, this inspection is more than routine. It's a physical manifestation of Roman policy entering a new phase. The chaos of Boudica's uprising is still a vivid memory. Burned towns, slaughtered colonists, Londinium in ashes. Agricola himself had witnessed the aftermath as a young military tribune serving under Suetonius Paulinus. In fact, Agricola had fought in the battle that put the revolt down. Now, nearly 2 decades later, he is transforming Britain in his own comprehensive vision. Rome will not merely occupy this island, it will comprehensively remake it. Agricola understands the imperial project better than most. Born in Forum Julii, modern Fréjus, in southern France, to a senatorial family, he represents the success of provincial integration into the empire. His father, Julius Graecinus, was executed by Caligula for failing to carry out a political execution of a family member of the emperor's, a fact which shapes his sense of both duty and caution. Trained in philosophy at Massilia, today Marseille, Agricola embodies the ideal Roman official, cultured yet pragmatic, disciplined yet adaptable. His first year as governor was spent securing the frontier and demonstrating Roman might. Tacitus, his son-in-law and eventual biographer, would later recount how Agricola immediately led a campaign against the Ordovices tribe in Wales, who had nearly annihilated a cavalry unit. Now, Tacitus's relationship here to Agricola presents a conflict of interest that should give us some pause. So, in fact, before we move on, let's actually pause the narrative and say that our knowledge of Agricola comes almost exclusively through the biography written by Tacitus, his, yes, son-in-law. So this creates obvious unparalleled insight, but also potential bias. Tacitus's book, Agricola, is both historical document and literary creation. It's an obviously personal tribute that simultaneously advances broader political arguments about virtue under tyranny during the Emperor Domitian's reign, of whom Tacitus was not necessarily always a fan. The portrait of the Agricola as the ideal governor reflects filial devotion and political agenda just as much as historical reality. Archaeological evidence confirms some aspects of Tacitus's reports: fort construction, road networks, expansion patterns, all of the things that makes Agricola an A-tier pencil pusher, but it also denies some of the accounts of Agricola being the first Roman to set foot in certain parts of northern Britain. The biography's famous opening declaration that writing about great men had become dangerous under Domitian frames Agricola's career as a potential silent rebuke to imperial excess. This literary framing serves Tacitus's purpose of contrasting his father-in-law's quiet competence with Domitian's supposed paranoid autocracy, but it also potentially obscures less flattering aspects of provincial administration. When evaluating Agricola's methods and achievements, we need to recognize that our window into his governorship comes through the admiring perspective of a family member writing partly to rehabilitate senatorial dignity during a period of autocratic excess. The biography's enduring value, though, comes precisely from this personal connection, providing unprecedented insight into how Rome's administrative class understood their imperial mission, while requiring careful reading as both a historical source and a political literature. This will not be the last case where we have people writing in what we would contemporarily define as conflict of interest situations. Thank you for hearing me out on that tangent. I think it's important. Where were we? Yes, in the first year as governor, in the late autumn when military operations typically would have ceased, Agricola drove his legions into the mountains and exterminated the tribe known to be the Ordovices in modern Wales due to them taking out a Roman cavalry unit. He followed this demonstration with the conquest of the island of Mona, the Druidic stronghold that Suetonius had abandoned to confront Boudica. Without naval support, Agricola's auxiliaries apparently swam across the Menai Strait, with their weapons held above water, managing to catch the island's inhabitants off guard due to there being no fleet of ships to signal the arrival of an invading force. There is currently, however, no archaeological verification for this pretty incredible claim. So this might be what we start calling a father-in-law moment for our good friend Tacitus. As Agricola turns back toward his camp, he contemplates his dual strategy. The morning's military reconnaissance will be followed by an afternoon handling civil administration. The governorship of Britannia is his personal crowning achievement. Unlike many governors who view provincial appointments as opportunities for personal enrichment or ladder climbing, Agricola approaches this role, as with all of his mid-level managerial roles, with his total focus and complete diligence. What Agricola represents to us historically is possibly the best middle manager that ancient Rome had to offer. During his governorship, corruption among tax collectors and procurement officers is curtailed, grain requisitions, a particular source of native resentment, are distributed more equally. Administrative posts previously monopolized by freedmen are opened to capable Britons. Forts and walls are built quickly and efficiently in equal measure to baths and other luxuries in the colonias. In his tent that evening, Agricola studies reports while dictating letters to his secretary. Maps of the northern territories lie unfurled on his table, weighted at the corners with stones collected from potential quarry sites. He's planning not merely military campaigns, but a comprehensive transformation of British society. Agricola's goal is for indigenous British elites to begin to wear the toga. It's for stone villas to replace round houses on the estates of the tribal aristocracy. It's for local councils, modeled on Roman municipal governance, to form in regions previously ruled by hereditary kings. The administrative efficiency of this system will make the extraction easier. Local elites will collect taxes from their own people, making resistance to Roman rule seen as equivalent to tribal betrayal. Agricola's methodical approach to conquest includes strategic infrastructure that will outlast not just his governorship, but Roman rule itself. Roads, arrow-straight and meticulously engineered, connect military installations while facilitating trade and administrative control. His engineers drain marshes, bridge rivers, and transform the landscape to accommodate Roman needs. Aerial photography in the modern era reveals outlines of Agricola's forts still visible in fields across northern Britain, a testament to their meticulous planning and construction. This is perhaps the most sophisticated phase of Roman imperialism. Unlike the crude exploitation seen in the early conquest or the brutal suppression following Boudica's revolt, this is colonialism perfected into a science. The conqueror no longer appears as an external oppressor, but as the agent of inevitable progress. Yet even as British elites embrace Roman ways, Agricola never forgets the military foundation of imperial power. Each summer sees new campaigns pushing northward. By the end of this decade, his legions will have marched beyond the Highland line, establishing forts at the edge of the Caledonian wilderness. The decisive engagement at Mons Graupius in 83 CE against a confederacy of Caledonian chiefs and kings will represent the northernmost advance of Roman power in Britain, a victory so complete that Emperor Domitian will supposedly grow jealous of its architect and recall Agricola to live out the rest of his days quietly in a villa in Gaul. The rumor was that his death in 93 CE was due to being poisoned by Domitian, but this is likely hearsay. But when he does leave Britain, Agricola will find it fundamentally transformed, ensuring that it would never again be free of Roman influences, even centuries after the last legionnaire departed. While Boudica fought Rome with swords and chariots, Agricola conquered Britain with roads, baths, and schools, weapons against which native resistance had no defense. Through calculated violence and strategic acculturation, he created not just a Roman province but a society that would deeply internalize imperial values. As night falls on his northern camp, Agricola reviews dispatches from Rome. Emperor Vespasian, who appointed him, has just died. The new emperor, Titus, continues his support for British campaigns, but court politics remain volatile. Already, there are whispers that Agricola's success makes him dangerous, too popular with the legions, too effective in his province. He understands that imperial favor is fickle. His father's execution under Caligula serves as a constant reminder. On the outskirts of another great empire is a different general, who also expands and solidifies the rule of his own imperial masters. We return now, finally, to China. '84 CE. In a weathered tent at a war camp somewhere in the western Tarim Basin, a Chinese general is far from home. But in his camp and in his war vest, there is no place that he would rather be. In fact, it was only this past year that he outright refused a recall order back to the imperial palace in Luoyang by his Emperor Zhang. Such is the confidence of General Ban Chao in his mission and his ability. He has been in these dusty deserts for a decade now, as equal parts general and diplomat, to fight the nomadic Xiongnu peoples and to secure important trade routes and alliances. Today, Ban Chao meets with envoys of the Kushan kingdom. Known to him as the Yeji, one of the envoys has a particularly odd, artificially elongated skull in the style of many of those Central Asian peoples who Chao has been variously at war or aligned with for the past decade. Both of the men in front of Chao wear patterned silks and turbans, contrasting with the simplicity of Chao's sandy old robes and leather vest. At 51 years old, the military commander from a renowned family of historians is the tip of the spear of Chinese expansion westward to the Caspian Sea. Outside of his tent, his soldiers mingle with traders, resting at the camp as a checkpoint before the next leg of their journey. Camels grunt and horses neigh as they loiter in the shade of the tents and silk-laden wagons outside. The merchant caravans have miles to go. They were supposed to depart for the grand city of Kashgar, then cross mountains and kingdoms, before ultimately reaching distant markets in the Kushan, Parthian, or even Roman empires. But now they are stalled and have congregated here for safety, as the city of Kashgar is currently undergoing a rebellion supported by the kingdom of Kangzhou, Chinese for the Sogdians, to the west. Ban Chao's play will be to align with the Kushans to nullify the rebellion before it gains too much footing. This is just another day in the Tarim Basin, where politics of China, India, Central Asia, and the Northern Steppe meet in a syncretic mess of cultural exchange and power plays over vital trade goods. This region and control over it dictates the flow of important goods and money supply across the whole of Eurasia, and Chao understands its importance. The very silks worn by these diplomats in front of him are Chinese in origin, and it's the profit from these goods that has ushered in a new golden age for what is now known as the Eastern Han Dynasty. Since we last visited China under Wang Mang's interregnum in 17 CE, much has changed. Mang's Jin dynasty collapsed quickly after his death in 23 CE, torn apart by the peasant rebellions that he himself helped to unleash. In the decades that followed, rival claimants rose and fell in brutal succession. Chang'an was sacked. Civil war turned whole provinces into smoldering fields until the Han dynasty was nominally restored by a man named Lu Zhu, a distant relative of the old imperial line. The new emperor called himself Guangwu, apparently meaning continuer and martial one, alluding both to his ideological commitment to returning to the Han and his status as a general. Guangwu defeated his rival claimants, defeated the Qimei red eyebrows peasants, moved the capital east from Chang'an to Luoyang, and managed to suppress the regional warlords. Guangwu's grandson, Zhang, now sits on the proverbial dragon throne. Zhang was the one who had recalled Ban Chao. But Chao, confident in his ability and decision-making since his youth, has other ideas. In fact, Ban Chao would bring the entirety of this basin to heel for the Eastern Han dynasty, supposedly vassalizing or conquering more than 50 kingdoms in the region through warfare and negotiation used in equal measure. The man was not born into this role, rather he chose it and learned it. His father, Ban Biao, a court historian and politician, raised him for scholarly pursuits, but for a reason that can only be known to Ban Chao, perhaps a curiosity about his maternal Xiongnu ancestry, he felt a calling to warfare in the western regions and set off as an assistant major in 73 CE. Sacrificing the pen for the sword proved to be a tremendous decision for Chao, as he rose through the ranks quickly. In less than a decade, he is to be named Protector General of all of the Ziyu western regions. His fighting force is small, and he continually finds himself outnumbered and surrounded, but through clever tactics and by playing kingdoms off of one another through adept politics, he has managed to place a firm foothold in the basin, making it his home away from home. Or so the history gets told. For like Agricola, Chao's story is told by family. More on that later. Somewhat of a pragmatist, Ban Chao, while meeting Confucian propriety, recognizes a rising religion in the region, growing in importance to the locals of Central Asia along the trade routes: Buddhism. This is somewhat of a prologue for our next episode, which will feature a lot more on the faith and its growth. We didn't really get to Buddhism, or really anyone in India this episode, and we will get there next episode, I promise. The proliferation of Buddhist monasteries under Chao's rule reveals religious transformation and a soft hand in the administration of religious matters. Monastic establishments serve as neutral diplomatic venues, translation centers, and merchant hostels. Buddhist temples receive Chinese agricultural support in exchange for intelligence about northern threats. While other Confucian elites of this time would criticize Buddhism, Ban Chao instead adapts to religious diversity as necessity for frontier stability. But his reputation came primarily as indispensable strong hand of Han authority in the West, one which only continued to rise in years to come. An anecdote affirming this says the following, quote, "When Han military officer Ban Chao went to Khotan, he was received by the king with minimal courtesy. The soothsayer to the king suggested that he should demand the horse of Ban, and Ban killed the soothsayer on the spot. The king, impressed by Ban's action, then offered his allegiance to Han." This ruthless desert diplomacy is that which Chao brokers now with the Kushans, whom he will form a tenuous alliance with to pacify Kashgar, wresting it back from Sogdian-backed rebels and re-establishing a Han-aligned regime. In the following years, Chao launches a series of targeted campaigns into the Fergana Valley, and by 90 CE, he had formally solidified Han control over the Ziyu, the western regions, extending Chinese influence as far as the Pamir Mountains in modern-day Tajikistan and laying the framework for an uninterrupted silk corridor from Luoyang to Parthian lands. He petitioned the court to send envoys to Rome itself, known in Chinese as Daqin, and while his chosen envoy, Gan Ying, made it only as far as the Persian Gulf, the intention alone reflects Ban Chao's vision, a unified trading zone across the spine of Eurasia. There's rumor, in fact, that when Chao inquired into the length of the expedition to Rome from Persia, that he was given false and inflated information about how long the mission would take. Perhaps the Parthians were keen to keep the Roman and Chinese from becoming conscious of one another, lest they hatched a plan to meet in the middle. Beyond securing trade routes for silk, jade, and gold, Ban Chao's western garrisons became intercultural contact zones where Chinese administrative techniques encountered Persian astronomy, Indian religious concepts, and Hellenistic artistic traditions. Chao's network of interpreters, merchants, and diplomats, envoys, transmitted knowledge in multiple directions. Buddhist texts moved eastward toward China, Chinese silk-making techniques spread westward despite imperial prohibitions, and astronomical knowledge flowed both ways. Ban Chao's pragmatic tolerance of Buddhism, a foreign religion, in western regions demonstrated his understanding that cultural synthesis served strategic purposes. Under his administration, the oasis cities of the Tarim Basin became multilingual hubs, where Tocharin, Sogdian, Prakrit, and Chinese speakers created pidgin languages for commerce. The Chinese histories record various, quote, strange customs of Western peoples that entered Han awareness through Ban Chao's expeditions, while Western accounts preserve garbled references to the land of Ceres, meaning China, received via those same networks. These cultural exchanges would have more lasting impact than his military victories, transforming both China and its Western neighbors through circulation of goods, techniques, and ideas along routes he secured. In fact, Chinese expansion during this period parallels the Romans in quite a conspicuous way. Ban Chao, just like Agricola, is interested in setting up infrastructure at the hinterlands of his empire, not for further appointments, but out of sheer commitment to the colonial project of his empire, for better or worse. Just as Agricola used both roads and force to Romanize the British Isles, so too did Ban Chao Sinicize the Tarim Basin, using garrisons and marriage diplomacy to turn it into a cultural satellite of the Han world. And like Agricola, Ban Chao would one day be pulled back from the frontier not by defeat, but by age and the shifting interests of the imperial courts. In 102 CE, Chao's health declining, he finally accepts recall and returns to Luoyang. He will die in the imperial palace just a month later, seemingly unable to live without his work in the western deserts. After his recall and his death, the Xiongnu would re-emerge in the basin, and China would not extend so far west as it did for another 6 centuries. We must pause for a note about sources, or lack thereof. Our understanding of Ban Chao's campaigns comes primarily through only 1 or 2 texts, written as official histories, compiled by court historians, including Ban Chao's own relatives, who we are about to meet. These texts followed established literary conventions that emphasized Chinese cultural superiority and portrayed barbarian peoples through tropes rather than accurate ethnography. The accounts focus on diplomatic submissions and military victories while minimizing setbacks or compromises, another parallel to the Romans. Archaeological evidence from Tarim Basin sites is very thin, and while claims are typically made of total Han control, we might be more inclined to think that there were more complex power-sharing arrangements with local elites. Non-Chinese perspectives on these events remain almost entirely absent from the historical record, though fragmentary Sogdian letters and Kharosthi inscriptions occasionally provide glimpses of how local populations viewed Chinese presence. Ban Chao's greatest victories may have been smaller than reported, while his diplomatic compromises were likely more extensive than Chinese sources acknowledge. Despite these limitations, the archaeological confirmation of Chinese outposts, thousands of kilometers from the Han heartland, attests to the remarkable scope of his achievement and the administrative sophistication that sustained such distant deployments in hostile territory. When Chao returned to the palace in Luoyang, he would have been greeted by the exceptional recent work of his family members, who had not abandoned the pen for the sword like he had. His younger sister, a decade his junior, would go on to finish a great work of history that would document and propagandize the exploits of the Han dynasty, creating the basis for knowledge on the period for years to come. We now reach the 10th decade of the 1st century and our last life of the episode. 99 CE, the end of the century. The soft scrape of a brush against bamboo is the only noise in the late night at the Imperial Library in Luoyang. A woman in her mid-50s, her hair streaked with gray, leans over a sprawling manuscript. Her posture is precise, her expression one of unyielding focus. This is Ban Zhou, historian, poet, philosopher, and one of the most renowned scholars of the Han Dynasty. Around her, shelves groan under the weight of scrolls, records of emperors, treatises on astronomy, commentaries on the 5 classics. The weight, also, is on her, weight of family. Ban Biao, Ban Gu, Ban Chao. Father, brother, brother. She knows and loves the Ban family in equal measure to the Han Dynasty itself. As she writes to her brother in the Shuyi, western provinces, she considers her ancestors in Chu during the Warring States period. She considers those frontier herder settlers in Lufan, now northern Shenxi province, who created wealth and success for the Ban name. Oil lamps provide light, their flames sending flickered shadows that dance on draped curtains of fine silk along the walls. Her brush pauses as she reviews a passage from her current project, the Book of Han, the Han Shu, to include in the letter to her brother, ever bound to the front line. The book is the monumental and comprehensive text of history begun by her father Bao, expanded by her brother Gu, and moving closer to its completion under her stewardship. She will eventually complete it in 111 CE. For Zhao, this is not merely a literary project. It's a dynastic mandate, a bridge between past and present, and the culmination of a lifetime navigating the tensions between scholarship and power. Her study of the history of Han goes hand in hand with the work of her brother Chao's, and perhaps we can even understand their motivations as being similar. They're descended not only from generations of Han settlers, but also from the pastoral first inhabitants of those settled regions, who have now been long pushed further north and west by Han expansion, the Xiongnu, the same Xiongnu that Chao chases through the desert, and the same Xiongnu that Zhou writes about Han exploits over. Ban Zhou's life mirrors the Han dynasty's own trajectory. In her eyes, a restoration of order after chaos. Born in 45 CE, she inherited a familial legacy intertwined with the empire's fate. Her father, Ban Biao, had chronicled the turbulent collapse of Wang Mang's Jin dynasty and the Han restoration under Emperor Guangwu. Her eldest brother, Gu, devoted his life to expanding this, compiling what would become the Book of Han, a definitive record of the Western Han's rise and fall. Her older brother Chao, as we have come to know, has spent decades securing the Silk Road as the protector general of the western regions, expanding Han influence to the edges of the known world. We have evidence to believe that this generation of siblings was close-knit, too. Beyond working on the Book of Han together, they went to bat for one another. Chao prevented Gu from arrest in 60 CE when the Emperor Ming caught word that Gu was rewriting Han history. Meanwhile, Zhou will, in just 3 years, advocate to the current Emperor He that Chao should come home to live out the last period of his life in peace in Luoyang. Ban Zhou herself is now more than merely a historian. She was tutored in the 4 books and 5 classics of Confucianism. She has learned astronomy, mathematics, and of course history in a society that has both condemned women to subjugation under men, but also given some of them the means to be able to intellectually compete with men in politics and scholarship. She has put her privileged position in a tremendously respected family to good use. For she is now a teacher of great women. In fact, a young and brilliant pupil named Deng Sui has just left Zhao's study from a private tutoring session. Lady Deng is a new consort of Emperor He's, and she will one day rise so high in Chinese society so as to become the Empress Dowager, the regent, and the unofficial ruler of China for years. When she does so, she will make Ban Zhou one of her ladies-in-waiting. Ban Zhou in 99 CE has emerged as a prodigy in public-facing intellectualism in a time and place that confined most women to domestic life in accordance with strict, orthodox Confucian adherence. She is also working on a piece of philosophy called Lessons for Women, on understanding and communicating the role and place of women in a proper Confucian society. It will be read for hundreds of years by women as a practical guide for surviving but also exceeding under the Chinese Confucian social order of upper-class Han China. It will be read for thousands of years in the future for different reasons yet. Scholars in the last few decades still debate as to whether Zhao's work was either feminist or misogynistic, and there's good argument to be made that one can read it as either to varying degrees. As an interesting anecdote, researchers Li and Linley in 2009 would suggest that Zhao's outlook prescribes women a, quote, different concept of agency, one that is familial, communal, indirect, and conferred by others, forged out of the powerlessness of individual women. Ban Zhao has a quote in Lessons for Women which might be instructive. What is womanly virtue? Fu de. She does not distinguish herself in talent and intelligence. What is womanly speech? Fu yan. She does not sharpen her language and speech. What is womanly manner? Fu yong. She does not seek to be outwardly beautiful or ornamented. What is womanly merit? Fu gong. She does not outperform others in her skills and cleverness. There are two things going on here. One, Zhao is clearly arguing for women to subjugate themselves in order to succeed as women, which is an argument that could be practical out of necessity or because it was her genuinely held Confucian value. Two, if one reads carefully, they might hear a subtle admission that this whole logic depends on the idea that women need to force themselves to not be the intellectual equals of men, potentially leaving open the idea that by nature they are the intellectual equals of men. Zhao also advocates these things despite being privately tutored and privately tutoring women, which would seem to directly contradict some of her points. So, is it possible that this was advice for women to get ahead in a patriarchal society and literally keep their heads while doing it? Perhaps. With that said, one of the most consequential tenets of Lessons for Women is the, quote, uncompromised fidelity to the husband, including an injunction not to remarry. And as a byproduct of the success of her own work, she incidentally ended up influencing centuries of very conservative ideals about how women must behave in order to be deemed right with Confucian hierarchy. In Lessons for Women, there's certainly a promotion of, quote, subservience, obedience, humility, devotion, and self-restriction by women, which has contributed to a long-term loss of power for women as it's congealed into ideology through history. Just as the words of Jesus and Paul will be immortalized and then reinterpreted and turned into social truths in the years to come, so too will Ban Zhao's. This is a phenomenon that we might watch happen here quite often with our theorists and scholars throughout the episodes, whether religious or secular, populist or elite. Ban Zhao did not only come to set ways for Chinese women to define themselves and be defined for centuries, but work by her and her family would contribute to how China as a whole would define itself for centuries. Completion of the Book of Han transcended mere historical documentation to become an exercise in imperial legitimation. By establishing the historical continuity between the Western and Eastern Han dynasties, despite Wang Mang's interruption, the work provided essential ideological foundation for later Han claims to the mandate of heaven. Her historical methodology, organizing imperial annals, hereditary houses, and treatises on various subjects, established the standard format that official histories would follow for 2 millennia. The Ban family's intimate connection to the imperial court made their history simultaneously scholarly achievement and political document. Ban Zhao's sections on imperial women, rituals, and astronomy reinforced ideological narratives about cosmic and social order, presenting the Han imperial system as a natural extension of heavenly principles. When she documented Western Han policies on currency, taxation, and foreign relations, she provided precedents that contemporary officials could cite to support their positions. This historiographical approach, simultaneously documenting and legitimizing imperial government, created templates for state-sponsored history throughout Chinese tradition. Ban Zhao thus helped establish one of Imperial China's most distinctive features, the systematic use of historical precedent as governing principle, where past practice gained normative authority. Her scholarly work, far from being politically neutral, helped construct the ideological apparatus that sustained imperial authority by naturalizing its conventions through historical narrative. Ban Zhao will die a quiet death in Chenliu Commandery where she accompanies her son, who carries on the family legacy, not of the Ban name, but as Chao Cheng, as a state official. True to form, Chao will write about her travels on the way, and after her death in 120 CE, her daughter-in-law will find many of her works and release them. The Han court of the late 1st century CE was a place of paradox. Emperor He, though nominally sovereign, relied on a network of eunuchs and consort clans to administer an empire stretching from the Tarim Basin to the South China Sea. Ban Zhao and her pupil Lady Deng are a part of a group of individuals who are rising in power in a Han Golden Age that is just beginning to possibly overripen.